All right, looking at problem 1, you're going to see that we always want to either have our flowchart written down or have it committed to memory. This is something that I think would be helpful for you to put onto a note card and just have it by your desk there as you are working. So when we look at our first problem over here in white, we have that x squared minus 3x minus 10. And so we always start up here with looking to see if there is a greatest common factor that exists. And so when I look at the 1, 3, and 10 here, the only greatest common factor that we have is a 1, which is not helpful for this process. We have an x squared, a 3x, and there's no x with the 10. And so there's not a variable that is the greatest common factor. So for this particular problem, there is no greatest common factor. So I'm done with that. And now I look at this and see there is 1, 2, 3 terms. And that tells me how to start the problem then, that I have 3 terms. And it tells me to go ahead and use that idea of reversing our multiplication by using the box. So I'm going to take and draw a box. And I'm going to start with my x squared here is x times x. And then I'm going to put my negative 10 here. When I put that negative 10 there, I know that as I'm looking for the factors, one of my factors is going to be positive and the other one is going to be negative. So when I think that it's 1 and 10 and 2 and 5, keep in mind that what I'm really thinking is that it could be a negative 1 times 10 or a 1 times a negative 10. It could be a negative 2 times 5 or a 2 times a negative 5. So it takes those two combinations, it makes it 4. Now what I'm looking for is that this is a negative 3x. And so when I look at the adding up these different combinations, I can see that this combination right here, when I add the 2 and the negative 5, will indeed give me a negative 3. So I'm going to take and put a positive 2 here, and I'm going to put a negative 5 here. Now keep in mind that I could have put the 5 here and the 2 there. That doesn't matter. What's important is that the 2 is positive and that the 5 is negative. Okay, now that I've got what I believe are the correct combinations, get that out of there to make up more space. I'm going to take and multiply 2 times x, 2x, and 2 times the negative 5, negative 5x. Then I'm going to check myself. If I look at this, here's my x squared. Yes, that's correct. If I add these two together, negative 5x and positive 2x, that's going to give me a negative 3x. That's correct. And there's my negative 10. So that tells me that I have now found the two factors, and those factors are x plus 2 and x minus 5. And keep in mind that you could have written this as x minus 5 and x plus 2. Okay, those are our valid answers. Remember that one thing that we cannot do is we cannot take and write this as x plus 5 and x minus 2. We can't switch those signs around. That's not the correct answer. Okay, let's look at number 2. All right, ladies and gentlemen, for this weekly review, we're going to be looking at all of the different types of factoring that we have done so far in this polynomial section. So if you could take a moment and write down these 4 problems, you may need to pause the video. I'm going to read them out loud though, for those of you that find that helpful. Number 1 is x squared minus 3x minus 10. Number 2 is 3x squared minus 33x plus 72. Number 3, 3x to the 4th minus 2x to the 3rd plus 18x squared minus 12x. Number 4, 3x squared plus 12. If you need additional time to copy these down, go ahead and pause the video now. So in number 2, we have a 3x squared minus 33x plus 72. So the first thing I'm going to think of is, does this have a greatest common factor? And so I'm looking at a 3, a 33, and a 72. And indeed, all of those numbers are divisible by 3. So I'm going to take and divide all of them by 3. And that is going to give me x squared minus 11x plus 24. Now, I wrote this in white because what I have here in white may factor even further. So when I look at what is here in white, this is a quadratic 1, 2, 3 trinomial. And so I'm going to look at this and see if it factors using our 3 terms. So I will take and draw the box. And here's my x squared, x times x. Here's my positive 24. And then I'm going to look at the factors of 24. 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. I need to select factors of 24 that are going to be able to make a negative 11. So what I will need to use is this 3 and 8, but it will be a negative 3 and a negative 8. Why? Because when I multiply negative 3 times negative 8, I get 24, which is what I want here. If I add together negative 3 and negative 8, I get negative 11, which is the middle term that I'm looking for up here. So I'm going to write in a negative 3 here and a negative 8 here. If I multiply negative 3 times x, that'll be negative 3x. If I multiply x times negative 8, that'll be negative 8x. So when I go to check myself, my x squared, there it is. Add those together, negative 3 and negative 8, negative 11x, and there's my 24. So that tells me that I have found my factors. I'm ready to write my answer. This is x minus 3, and this is x minus 8. And I can't forget, and some people will do this, they'll drop it down right at the very beginning. Remember, we took out this GCF, right? That GCF must show up in our final answer. And so that GCF is right here. And there's our answer. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next one. The next one here, we have 3x to the 4th minus 2x to the 3rd plus 18x squared minus 12x. So I am starting, like always, by looking for, is there a GCF? So I'm looking at 3, 2, 18, and 12. And so when I look at the numbers, the constants, I do not see a greatest common factor between all 4 of those. But what I do see is that each one of these contain an x. So this time, my GCF is a variable x. So I'm going to divide everything here by an x. And then that will give me 3x to the 3rd, a negative 2x squared, 18x minus 12. So I have done this first step where I did a greatest common factor. I now look at what I have over here in blue, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. And if I look at my flow chart here, 4 terms tells me that I'm going to try grouping. Now this is one that I highly recommend that you if you want to go down to write your answer, that you take that GCF and write it there, and then write 2 parentheses to get ready for your answer, okay? So that we don't forget that greatest common factor of x. So I'm going to take and split this into 2 groups. When I look at my first group, 3x to the third minus 2x squared, I look for the GCF there. So between 3 and 2, GCF is 1, so not helpful. But there's an x to the third and x to the second, so the GCF there is an x to the second. And so remember, I pull the GCF out front, and then I take and say this is going to be 3x minus 2. So there's my first group. Now I'm going to look at my second group, which is a positive 18x minus 12. Now, it's important that it's a positive, because if it were a negative, the GCF that I would be removing would be negative, which would mean down here, this sign would be a minus sign connecting them instead of a positive sign. Our GCF here is going to be 6. So I'll put that GCF out front, and then I'm going to have 3x minus 2. And remember that if we've done this correctly, that our parentheses here should match up. That is our one factor. Our second factor we pull together from the 2 greatest common factors. So our greatest common factor from the first group here was x squared. I put that right here. And the second greatest common factor from this group was a positive 6. This goes here. If I look at what is left, there's 3 things that I'm multiplying them together. I must check now, do any of those have a greatest common factor? Well, x is just an x, it doesn't. 3x minus 2 doesn't. X squared plus 6 doesn't. Since I have 2 terms, I also have to check if they make perfect square minus perfect square. If I look at this one, perfect square minus perfect square, the only thing that matches is a minus, so that one doesn't factor any further. Here I have a perfect square, but then I have a plus sign and a non-perfect square. So that tells me it doesn't go any further either, and this is my answer. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the very last one. Our very last one is 3x squared plus 12. And like always, we're starting up here. What's our greatest common factor? And our greatest common factor for this one is 3. So I'm going to factor out a 3. And when I do that, in parentheses, I'm going to have left an x squared plus 4. Okay. And now I'm going to look right here, right at what's inside the parentheses. And what I have is 2 terms, and I'm going to ask myself, does it meet this for 2 terms? So I'm asking myself, is this a perfect square minus a perfect square? And what I notice is that x squared is a perfect square, and that 4 is a perfect square, but I have a plus sign instead of a minus, and I know that won't work. And so this cannot factor any further. And this is my final answer.